LiSTNR production.
Crikey, shouldn't be walking in this heat. Need a ride, love?
The Truro Murders case is one of Australia's most chilling serial murder investigations. It involves the deaths of 7 young women in South Australia during the mid-1970s. The primary perpetrators were Christopher Robin Worrell and James William Miller, whose actions and subsequent trial have left a lasting impact on the Australian criminal landscape. I'm Dan Mullins. This is Crime Insider's Judgment, a deep dive on a judge's final verdict of a crime and what transpired to incite that judgment. Between December 1976 and February 1977, 7 young women, Veronica Knight, Tanya Kenny, Juliet Makita, Sylvia Pittman, Vicky Howell, Connie Iordandes, and Deborah Lamb were abducted, raped, and murdered. Their bodies were discovered in various locations, including Truro, Wingfield, and Port Gawler in South Australia, often in remote bushland areas. The victims ranged in age from 15 to 26 years old. The modus operandi involved Worrell and Miller cruising the streets of Adelaide in Worrell's 1969 blue and white Chrysler Valiant wagon, picking up women, often hitchhikers.
Shouldn't be walking in this heat. Need a ride, love?
Worrell would sexually assault them, and the women were subsequently murdered, typically by strangulation. Miller, who accompanied Worrell, claimed he was unaware of the murders beforehand and only assisted in disposing of their bodies after the fact. The case remained unsolved until 1978, when a mushroom picker discovered the remains of Veronica Knight near Truro. This discovery led to a series of investigations that uncovered the bodies of the other victims. The breakthrough came when Amelia, a woman who had been with Miller and Worrell, came forward with statements implicating Miller. She claimed that Miller had referred to the victims as only rags and had said they had to be done in so that they could not point the finger at us. Miller denied making these statements. Miller was arrested and charged with the murders. His trial began in 1980, where he was found guilty of 6 of the 7 murders, with the exception of Veronica Knight's. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. During the trial, Miller maintained that he was merely an accessory after the fact, assisting in disposing of the bodies, but not participating in the murders themselves. However, the prosecution argued that his presence at the crime scenes and his actions in helping to conceal the bodies made him complicit in the murders. Judge Roderick Matheson, who presided over the trial, instructed the jury to find Miller guilty, stating that his involvement in the joint criminal enterprise was sufficient to convict him of murder. This directive led to controversy, with one juror later petitioning for a retrial, arguing that the judge's instructions were improper. However, the Attorney General at the time, Chris Sumner, refused to grant a retrial. Miller's conviction sparked debates about the legal definitions of complicity and joint criminal enterprise. His case highlighted the complexities of attributing guilt in cases where direct involvement in the act of murder is not clear-cut. In 1999, Miller applied for a non-parole period under new laws. Chief Justice John Doyle granted a 35-year non-parole period, making him eligible for parole in 2014. Miller maintained his innocence until his death in 2008 from liver failure related to hepatitis C. The Truro Murders case remains a significant chapter in Australia's criminal history, raising questions about justice, complicity, and the moral responsibilities of individuals involved in criminal activities. Following Miller's conviction, Judge Matheson remarked on the severity of the crimes, describing Worrell as a depraved and disgusting human being. While specific statements from Judge Matheson regarding Miller's involvement are not publicly documented, his comments on Worrell's character suggest a strong condemnation of the actions that led to the murders. So, who is James Miller? Miller had spent nearly his entire 34 years trapped behind cold prison walls. Raised in a family of 6 children, he left home at a very young age, seeking somewhere to belong. At age 11, he was sent away to the McGill Reform School, a place that didn't offer him much hope or guidance. Without a proper education, Miller fell into a life of petty crime, stealing cars, breaking into homes, and working odd jobs as an itinerant labourer when he could. Despite his many run-ins with the law, over 30 convictions for theft, carjacking and break-ins, Miller always insisted he had never committed violence or sexual offences. He often said, with a note of defensiveness in his voice, "That's not who I am." One day, in the Adelaide jail, during a brief stint for breaking into a gun shop, Miller met a young man named Christopher Worrell. Worrell was awaiting trial on a rape charge and was also under a suspended sentence for armed robbery. Worrell was handsome, with long dark hair and a slim build, and despite their different backgrounds, a strange friendship blossomed between the two. Within a week, they found themselves sharing a cell. Worrell confided in Miller, revealing he had never known his biological father and that his mother had remarried when he was 6. Worrell was sentenced to 4 years for the rape charge and an additional 2 years for breaching his suspended sentence. Worrell and Miller grew close. When later transferred to Yatala prison, they no longer shared a cell but remained inseparable friends. After Miller's 3-month sentence ended, he was released, but it wasn't long before they were behind bars together again. This time, Miller received 18 months for stealing thousands of pairs of sunglasses and selling them around Adelaide. 9 months after his release, Worrell was granted early parole. The two reunited on the outside, with Miller living with his married sister and her 2 daughters. Worrell visited frequently, and the 2 men had plans to rent a flat together. Their relationship, though, was complicated. Miller, who was passive by nature, often engaged in oral sex with Worrell while Worrell read magazines about bondage. Miller was gay, but Worrell was interested in women. They found work together on local road crew projects, and Miller later recalled those days as the happiest of his life. He was fiercely loyal to Worrell, willing to do anything for his friend. But Worrell was a volatile man, moody, unpredictable, prone to sudden outbursts that Miller would have to calm with patience and gentle words. By the time Worrell was 23, he was handsome and charismatic, with a gift for charming women.
Crikey, shouldn't be walking in this heat.
While Miller drove them around in his old 1969 Valiant, Worrell would approach women at bus stops, hotels and train stations. Sometimes they would go to secluded spots where Worrell would engage in sexual acts with the women, often including tying them up. Miller believed that Worrell would never harm these women, and he trusted him. Yet a shadow of doubt began to linger. Their story was one of complex friendship, loyalty, and darkness, an intricate tapestry woven with hardship, desire, and secrets that would shape their lives in ways no one could fully understand. Coming up, the impact of the murders and how Miller tried to clear his name. The Truro murders occurred in a period when Adelaide, South Australia, was grappling with a series of high-profile crimes, contributing to its reputation as Australia's murder capital. Alongside cases like the Snowtown murders and the family murders, the Truro case cemented a dark chapter in the state's history. Truro itself is a small agricultural town in the Mid-Murray Council area, originally established in 1848 and named after the Cornish city due to the influence of Cornish miners who worked the nearby Wheelbarton copper mine. The town's quiet, rural setting contrasted starkly with the horrific discoveries that would later bring it infamy. The Truro murders spanned a frenzied 7-week period from December 23, 1976 to February 12, 1977, during which 7 young women were abducted, raped and murdered. The victims were primarily from Adelaide's suburbs and were targeted seemingly at random as Worrell and Miller cruised the streets looking for victims. The killings escalated in frequency, with the final 4 murders occurring in just 6 days, a pattern criminologist Paul Wilson noted as a characteristic of serial killers whose compulsion intensifies over time. Let's look at the victims. In 1984, James Miller published an autobiography ghostwritten by Dick Wordley, entitled Don't Call Me Killer. He wrote it behind bars. Veronica Knight went missing on December the 23rd, 1976. Miller says, on Christmas Eve, he and Worrell drove through Adelaide, observing the crowds. Miller left the car to meet a friend, then rejoined Worrell, who had approached Veronica, who was alone. She was then persuaded to get into their car, taken for a drive into the hills, and then assaulted by Worrell. When Miller returned, Veronica was unconscious. They drove to Truro, where they buried her in sand and covered her with branches. Tanya Kenny was last seen on January 2nd, 1977. Miller claimed he dropped off Worrell in Rundle Mall, who then returned with 15-year-old Tanya. They drove to a relative's house where Tanya was found bound, gagged and strangled in a children's playroom. Her body was later buried at Dean Rifle Range near Wingfield. Juliet Makita was 16 when she went missing just days later. Juliet was a Marsden High School student who worked at a city jewellery booth during school holidays. On that fateful night, she planned to return home late. She stopped at a phone booth to call her parents. Waiting for her bus outside the Ambassador's Hotel around 9 p.m.
Need a ride, love?
She accepted a ride from Miller and Worrell. They drove to Port Wakefield Road, where Worrell forced Juliet into the back seat, tied her up, and she struggled. Miller at one point saw Juliet being kicked and strangled by Worrell using a rope. Miller says he left briefly, returning to find Juliet missing, likely in the trunk. The men drove to Truro, disposing of her body in an old farmhouse, covering her with branches before leaving. Sylvia Pittman was 16 when she was abducted on February the 6th, 1977. Sylvia was waiting at Adelaide railway station when 2 men, Miller and Worrell, approached her offering a lift. They drove her to a secluded spot near Wingfield where Miller left to go for a walk. Upon returning, he found Sylvia covered with a rug. She had been strangled with her own pantyhose. They transported her to Truro, laid her on the ground, covered her with sticks, and left. Vicky Howell was 26 when she went missing on the 7th of February 1977. Miller met Worrell at a local post office and said in the book Vicky was already with Worrell. He says he stopped the car and went for a walk. When he returned, he saw nothing particularly untoward and then took an even longer walk. He said in the book when he arrived back at the car, Hal was dead and Worrell was in a rage. Miller lost his temper and abused Worrell, so much so, Miller himself feared he may have been murdered. The tension then eased and Hal's body was then taken to Truro. Connie Iordanides, also known as Connie Jordan, went missing on the 9th of February 1977, aged just 16. Miller says he and Worrell picked up Connie in the city centre and offered her a lift home. When Connie realised they were heading in the wrong direction to where she'd been asked to be taken, she became frightened. Miller stopped the car at Wingfield, some 13 kilometres down the road, and Worrell forced the screaming girl into the back seat, while Miller did nothing. Miller claimed in the book he then went for a walk. When he returned, they drove the body to Truro. Deborah Lamb was 20 when she went missing on the 12th of February 1977. Miller claimed in the book Lamb was picked up while hitchhiking on West Terrace in downtown Adelaide. They drove 35 minutes out to Port Gawler, where Miller went for his walk. He claimed that when he returned to the car, Lamb was nowhere to be seen, and Worrell was pushing sand into a hole with his foot. Lamb was later buried alive at that spot. The victims were typically restrained, sexually assaulted and strangled, with their bodies dumped in remote locations, primarily around Truro, but also at Wingfield and Port Gawler. The method of killing and disposal suggested a calculated effort to evade detection, though the choice of dumping grounds was haphazard, contributing to their eventual discovery. The murders remained undetected until April 20, 1978, over a year later, when William, or Bill Thomas, and his brother were mushrooming in bushland near Swamp Road east of Truro, when they found what they initially thought was a cow bone. Bill's wife, Valda, urged a closer inspection and found a human bone with a shoe containing human skin and painted toenails. The gruesome find prompted police to become involved, and on the 1st of May 1978, a large search party uncovered 2 more skeletons. They were identified as Connie Iordanides and Vicky Howell. The discoveries linked to 5 other missing women from Adelaide, leading police to suspect a serial killer was at large. By 1979, the remains of 7 women were found, 5 in the Truro bushland, 1 at Wingfield, and 1 at Port Gawler. Forensic experts used dental records to confirm the identities of 5 victims and supported the identification of 2 others whose records had been destroyed. Craniofacial video superimposition was also used, marking a significant advancement in forensic techniques in Australia. Christopher Worrell was believed to have been the killer, described as a serial psychopathic, sexually sadistic homicide offender, and likened to the American serial killer Dennis Rader, or BTK, due to his methodical approach to binding, torturing, and killing his victims. Rader is serving 10 life sentences for killing and or raping at least 10 people in the US state of Kansas between 1974 and 1991. Worrell's charisma and sociopathy allowed him to lure women with ease. Miller, his older accomplice, claimed he was coerced into participating due to his love for Worrell, insisting he never directly harmed the victims but assisted in disposing of the bodies. The dynamic between Worrell and Miller was complex. Miller's testimony suggested a one-sided relationship where Worrell's dominance drove the crimes, with Miller acting as a submissive enabler. However, Miller's presence at every crime scene and his role in disposing of the bodies implicated him deeply. The last victim, went missing on the 12th of February 1977. Worrell died in a car accident on February 19 that year. Criminologist Paul Wilson suggested that Worrell's death halted what could have been an even more devastating killing spree as the time between murders was decreasing. 1 year to the day after Worrell's death, Miller placed a few paragraphs in the In Memoriam section of the Adelaide Advertiser. The notice read, "Worrell, Christopher Robin. Memories of a very close friend who died 12 months ago this week. Your friendship and thoughtfulness and kindness, Chris, will always be remembered by me, mate. What comes after death, I can hope, as I pray we meet again." Miller's arrest came after a chance comment to Worrell's girlfriend revealing his knowledge of the murders. He claimed the killings were getting worse and that Worrell's death was perhaps a good thing, indicating his awareness of the escalating violence. Despite his insistence that he was not a direct participant, Miller was charged with murder as part of a joint criminal enterprise. Now to the investigation and trial. The South Australian Police faced significant challenges in piecing together the case due to the initial lack of connection between the disappearances. The media and public's indifference to the missing women, often attributed to their youth and gender, delayed early investigations, a point later criticised by the Advertiser newspaper and reflected upon in Jeff Plunkett's book Death Row at Truro. The police's eventual success relied heavily on forensic evidence, particularly dental records and Miller's confessions after his arrest. Miller stood trial in March 1980 and was convicted of 6 of the 7 murders, with the exception of Veronica Knight's murder, for which evidence was insufficient to prove his direct involvement. Unusually, Miller was found guilty of murder despite claiming he never physically harmed the victims, as his participation in the joint criminal enterprise, being present at the crime scenes and assisting with body disposal, met the legal threshold for culpability. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms, one of the harshest penalties in South Australian history. But the trial sparked controversy. Miller maintained his innocence, arguing, "They can give me life for knowing about the murders and not reporting them, but they charged me with murder. It's a load of bullshit." One juror, believing the trial judge, Justice Matheson, had improperly directed the jury to find Miller guilty, hired a lawyer to petition for a retrial. South Australian Chief Justice Len King supported the call for a new hearing, but Attorney General Chris Sumner refused, upholding the conviction. James Miller spent 28 years in prison. He was one of South Australia's longest-serving prisoners. He protested his conviction through a 43-day hunger strike and wrote a novel titled Don't Call Me Killer, asserting his limited role. Miller died in prison on the 21st of October 2008 at age 68 from liver failure and complications of hepatitis C, prostate cancer and lung cancer. Mike Makita, the father of the victim Juliet Makita, described Miller's death as the end of a sad chapter, reflecting the lack of closure for many of the victims' families. The Truro Murders had a lasting impact on South Australia. The case exposed flaws in police and media responses to missing persons cases, particularly those involving young women whose disappearances were initially dismissed as runaways or even insignificant. While the narrative of the Truro Murders is well documented, some aspects remain contentious. Miller's claim of non-involvement in the killings themselves raises questions about his true role. Some sources, like Ryan Green's book, The Truro Murders, The Sex Killing Spree Through the Eyes of an Accomplice, suggest Miller may have been more complicit than he admitted. The police's initial failure to link the disappearances also points to systemic issues in addressing violence against women, a recurring theme in critiques of the case. Additionally, the legal precedent set by Miller's conviction, holding an accomplice fully accountable despite no direct act of killing, remains a point of debate in criminal law, balancing individual responsibility against collective criminality. Over 7 weeks, Christopher Worrell and James Miller killed 7 young women, leaving a trail of devastation uncovered only through chance and forensic diligence. The case exposed societal and institutional shortcomings while advancing forensic science in Australia. Though Miller's conviction and death closed the legal chapter, the emotional and cultural scars persist, ensuring the Truro Murders remain a haunting part of South Australia's history. Thanks for listening to Crime Insider's Judgements. We love hearing your feedback, so please rate and review this episode. If you have a case you want us to cover, let us know via Instagram at LiSTNR Crime or TikTok at LiSTNR Crime Team. I'll be back again next Thursday with another case. I'm Dan Mullins. Thanks for listening. This series was recorded and produced on Gadigal land.